Good afternoon. Welcome to More Tea Minister. My name is Ian. Today we are reviewing a tea that is interesting and unusual in a few different respects. First of all, it hails from the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. Now, it would be unfair to say that Bhutan is cut off from the rest of the world, or that it isn't already engaged in international commerce. However, I think it's worth celebrating anything that comes out as far as, my country, from Bhutan. And so that makes it unusual. There aren't many teas made in Bhutan. That said, the particular farmers' cooperative responsible for this tea also produces black tea and green tea and oolong. So there's a growing portfolio of teas that are available to customers who are interested. A second thing to make this tea interesting is that it is another example of dark tea or post-fermented tea. Anybody who watched the video on Goishi cha may recall that fermenting tea to make dark tea can be a straightforward process, or it can be multi-stage, or in the case of Goishi cha, it can involve two distinct kinds of fermentation. In the case of Ja Aum, it's not so much the complexity of the process, although I believe it can take up to 8 days to accurately and completely produce the tea. It's a fact that it has a very unusual component for the fermentation. I don't know whether this component triggers the fermentation or assists it, but it is ash. It is ash from an oak tree. So that's a very unusual and distinctive and interesting ingredient. So that's today's tea, Ja Aum, a dark tea from Bhutan. Before we go any further, I think it's worth considering the vendor's own description of the tea. I bought this tea from O5 Tea, which is the O5 Tea Bar based in Vancouver, BC. I have here a package of Ja Aum and their packaging of it. I think it's fair to say that the packaging in terms of the label, if it was blank, and this resealable pouch would be a standard vendor's offering. However, O5 are to be commended on the sheer scale of the information that they provide on their website and on their packaging. There's a lot of very dense text here, so I will just highlight the relevant parts. First of all, they're calling it Divine Madman's Ja Aum, Oak Ash Fermented Dark. I should point out that there's a slight variation in that title and that to be found on their website, which I have transcribed here. On the website, it's called Divine Madman's Oak Ash Fermented Dark Tea, pause for Bhutanese tea with butter. More on that in a moment. The Divine Madman in question is a very significant figure in Bhutanese cultural and religious history. However, the details of his life, whilst fascinating, I think it would be fair to say are NSFW. And so I will leave it up to any viewers who are interested to go to O5's website and then do some research of their own. It's certainly a very interesting character. Below the title of the product, there is a very helpful set of tasting notes, and below that, there are some incredibly precise details about the location at which this tea is grown. Samboling and Bhutan, they even provide a latitude and a longitude. There's information below that about the Samboling Tea Cooperative who have produced this tea, and then for the sake of our purposes, I'm putting my glasses on for this, the most interesting and pertinent information is to be found at the bottom. 3 grams, 240 mils, 100 degrees centigrade for 75 seconds. This is a 40-gram pouch. That's an interesting ratio of tea to water. It's not quite at the sort of proportions, forgive me, that's my kettle again, it's not quite at the proportions of a standard Western brewing of tea, but it's also not quite as concentrated an amount of tea as you might expect from, let's say, a cereal steeping or gong fu way of preparing the tea. I should point out that another vendor has very helpfully provided some brewing parameters for producing this tea or brewing this tea in that serial steeping way, and we may look at that in a different video. Another thing to say about these brewing parameters, as useful as they are, is that they aren't the only ones provided by the vendor. As I say, they are to be commended for the depth and detail of information they provided. They have, in fact, provided 3 different kinds of brewing parameters, depending on how you wish to prepare this tea. The way we are following is called Tang. It's the easiest way to enjoy Bhutanese fermented tea. There is also Suja, which is the format I suspect that is most utilized in Bhutan and in Tibet, where the tea is drank with butter and a pinch of salt. And the tea is fairly liberally brewed at high concentration, and then butter and ghee is added, along with a pinch of salt. And then finally there is uja, which is a way of preparing this tea that I think would be most familiar to drinkers of chai and Western tea drinkers, in that it enjoyed with milk and some kind of sweetener, whether that is honey or sugar. So, very interesting that we now also have 3 different ways of preparing this tea. I think at this point it would be interesting to take a look at the tea itself, take a smell of the dry leaf, and have a think about how this tea might have been produced, because that's one of the details that I haven't been able to glean so far. So I'm not sure how much of this you'll be able to see on this camera, but it's very dark leaf. Some of it is recognizable as leaf fragments that have been fermented. There's a lot of fermented stalk. None of this is a surprise. It's often the case with dark tea that there's no need to use the finest grade of leaf because it's going to be heavily fermented anyway. One thing that I have noticed about this tea is that it's loose. It doesn't seem to have undergone any kind of compression into a brick or a cake form, which is one of the common ways to prepare fermented dark tea for storage, long-term aging, and transport. That said, I have found throughout the open pack I have of this tea, one of these, not necessarily as big as this. This is, or it looks to my untrained eye, like a tea nugget. Now, a tea nugget is produced by a particular method of fermenting tea when it's basically wet piled. That's the technical name. And essentially it's composted. And the act of turning the leaves over and that gentle compression produces randomly these little nuggets of tea. However, a caveat against what the conclusion of that may be is that that often leaves a certain kind of smell on the tea. So let's take a sniff of the tea. It's earthy and it's woody, and there is a scent that will come out in the taste that we'll discuss later. But it's a very clean and dry, woody, earthy smell. Wet piling often, but not always, produces a very distinctive smell in a tea, which I think Americans would call funky, and over here we would call fusty, a certain kind of stale or moldy kind of character. That's not to say that such a tea is stale or moldy, simply that the kind of process that produces tea nuggets often produces the tea that comes across as funky, whereas this isn't funky. So, this tea was grown and harvested in 2023. Interestingly, all the other vendors I've found have been selling this tea from 2023 as well. But I don't know what form this tea takes, or how it's stored, or how it's aged once it's been made. So, I think we can now move on to preparing this tea for brewing. I have in front of me the transparent jug so that we can see the finished tea together. Once again, forgive me, that's the kettle reboiling itself. I'm using my wide-brimmed strainer, and we are going to need this today. This strainer is for catching the tea if the tea is being brewed and poured out in a very swift manner, which is what we're going to have to do today, because 75 seconds is fairly precise. We have a cup. I'm pleased to say that this cup is part of a matching set along with my new teapot. I actually got two teapots along this line, the same color and the same glaze. They are small teapots, ideal for this kind of brewing, but they're not specialized. So what I'm going to do is a warmed teapot, as always, with the tea poured out. I'm going to pour the leaves in. Eagle-eyed viewers may notice I'm not using a measuring jug, and that's because the teapot can only hold 180 mils. So if I almost completely fill it, that will be the 160 mils that we need for this brewing. Remember, 160 mils of water and 2 grams of tea. So just leave a little room, and that should be our 160 milliliters of water. Now, I've said that 75 degrees centigrade, 75 seconds is fairly precise, but it's not so precise that a little bit of expertise can't take its place. And I've been brewing this tea a few times now with these parameters and with one or two others, trying to find a way that suits my taste. And this is a long-winded way of saying that judging by eye and by nose has its own place in brewing a tea, because ultimately it's always going to be about one's personal preferences. So at the moment, at the brewing, none of that earthy kind of quality has come out yet. And the woodiness and the other sort of additional scent that comes out in the tea, and that I think will be a kind of conclusive thing as to the character of this tea. So as I say in this first video on Jar Aum, I'm going to be following fairly closely the vendor's own brewing parameters, at least for the consult notes again, Jar Tang variety, the simplest way of producing it, hence the minimal equipment that we need for this. And I may do a video where we go over the tea in the Gong Fu style, where we will be using a slightly higher concentration of tea, but we'll be using a lot less water. So let's give the teapot a gentle shugle. That's a good local word. It just means a shake. I've tried to make sure that I don't use too many local words in these videos, or if I do, I make the effort to translate them. I found myself rehearsing this video, and in one sentence I used a Scottish slang word and a Yorkshire slang word and a slang word that my family and I have invented for ourselves. And so that sentence was just completely incomprehensible to the vast majority of people. Okay. That flavor profile has just about come through on the scent, so we'll just give that a few more seconds and give this a gentle shugle again. Hopefully you can remember what that means. As a side point, this teapot and these two matching cups are in a particular kind of glaze called a roux glaze, or a roux kiln pattern. And aside from this sort of azure color, means that the glaze will over time crackle. And I believe that with a careful application of tea to the teapot, you can actually accentuate the veins or the crackles between the glaze with tea. So I think that is enough of me talking. Let's pour out this tea as quickly as we can, hence the strainer. I'm going to tilt it back. We don't want any tea remaining in there because it will just continue to brew and be oversteeped, which you really don't need with this tea. So let's have a look at this tea. I'm going to hold it up to the light, and it's virtually opaque. If I hold it underneath, some light is coming through, but it's pretty dark. I'm going to see if there's some way for you to see the colour of the tea. I think you can see it's pretty dark. It's a very dark ruby, or even a treacle colour almost, we might say. What I've noticed in some ways of brewing this tea, there's a lot of very fine particles suspended in the tea, and that might be adding to the darkness. I want to stress that they don't affect the quality of the tea or the drinking of the tea. I suspect there may be particles of ash. It's not in any way a questioning of the quality of the tea. So, no, before we pour it out, we need to take a smell, don't we? It's woody, it's earthy, and there is an extra something that it's taken me a long while to try and find a name for. There's a kind of savoury note to it as well, but that's not quite the detail I'm looking for. So let's try this tea. These are very small cups. The tea can cool relatively quickly, and it means that even a small teapot's worth can be shared amongst a number of guests. I'm going to take another cupful because I'm greedy. The earthiness and the woodiness come through, but as I say, there's an extra element, and I realise now it's a kind of medicinal quality. I don't know if any viewers would be familiar with them, but there's a kind of cough sweet that is designed to clear out a chesty cough. And I don't know what the active ingredient is. It's not camphor, but it's certainly quite a volatile smelling ingredient in these cough sweets. And that's what's coming through in this. It's kind of sweet and savoury all at the same time. There's a kind of spicy element to it, but it's not any of those. So, what can we say about this tea in conclusion? Well, it's a very interesting tea, and in that respect, it's to be recommended. I'm very pleased that this tea from Bhutan is just one of a range of goods that Bhutan is exporting. It's only one of a range of teas that the Samboling Tea Cooperative is producing. The interest that the tea provokes has only been heightened by the sterling efforts of O5 Tea Bar to produce this information. And I say this voluntarily. I am in no way affiliated with them. I'm just impressed by what I've seen so far. The tea can be recommended through its ease of production, and I would heartily recommend this tea on its taste. It's very rich and it's very hearty. Even at these proportions, there's an excellent mouthfeel. And if you like a sort of rich, earthy, woody taste, without any of the funk or the foust that you might associate it with some ways of aging tea, this is definitely one that you might wish to try. Can it be recommended on ease of availability? Well, the vendor was easily accessible to me over here in the UK, so that's not a problem at all. And I have found some other vendors as well. But it's not necessarily the most easily and readily available of teas. At the risk of repeating myself, I can but only heartily recommend this tea for all those who are interested in teas from far-flung places, those who might be interested in exploring the material culture of Bhutan, and to taste something that is a sort of expression of a people who are reaching out into the wider international community. It only remains for me to wish you happy steeping and to say, God bless.